everybody and welcome to Getting Litty with Lydia, which is the series that I have recently begun on this channel where I reflect upon books that I read after I read them. And the reason that I'm doing this is because I know I have a tendency to forget what I read, and then also reading is something that is such like a mental exercise that when you're reading you come to realizations that you don't have realizations like that in your day-to-day life. So I'm like, it's important to take note of these things that I'm noticing as I'm reading because they come from a place of being highly engaged mentally in a way that I don't walk around in my day-to-day life, although I am a very, very thoughtful person. But let us begin. Today I am going over The Body Keeps the Score, and then also it's so that you can maybe not even have to read these books, and like even if you choose to not read the book, you still can like vicariously experience the experience of book reading. Today I'm reading The Body Keeps the Score, which is one that I've had in my possession for like 2 years now, and I've been wanting to read. No, it's more than that. It's been like 4 years that I've had it in my possession and have been trying to read it. But I just got around to it because it is so dense and it is so like difficult to sit down and read that I finally was just like, I'm just gonna audiobook this. And I did, and it was good. I'm gonna start out by saying, like, this is not gonna be a summary. This series is not a summary, it's a reflection, which means these are random things that pop into my head as I'm reading the book in no particular order, and if you really want to know what the book is about and if my reflections pique your interest, then you should actually read the book. Yeah, this book is about CPTSD and the way that trauma impacts our body and our mind, and how even though most people who have PTSD are not veterans, like it was not very widely talked about that most people suffering from PTSD were actually like children of abuse and neglect grown up. I just think it's really interesting. It was about that, and it was the first book of its kind to really come out and say like a lot of what we're seeing is actually trauma, and a lot of people who aren't getting better, it's because they're traumatized, and you need a different way of dealing with a traumatized patient than you do someone who is not traumatized. You can go through a tough time in life and seek therapy and have it clear up, but the traumatized patient will come in and be having a tough time, and they'll seek therapy to help with the tough time, and then they'll realize like it's not clearing up in the same way that it would a non-traumatized person, and usually the reason is because they're stuck in flashbacks. Flashbacks are something that you get as a traumatized person. They can be emotional or visual, and then there's also memory loss involved, and there's just a whole bunch of health issues that pop up throughout your life if you are a traumatized person. And a lot of times people who are traumatized in this way, they think that there's something wrong with them, but it actually has more to do with the fact that their body has adjusted to be constantly in a state of survival, and it taught itself that that's how it needs to be in order to survive, and therefore it's reluctant to let that go. And this is just talking about people's experiences with trauma and people's lives and how they're impacted by trauma, and then also how to get better and heal from trauma in some ways that were not previously talked about before the release of this book. It's a pretty great book. Okay, so the first thing that I want to talk about is corrective emotional experiences, and I've heard of this before, and he mentioned it in this book, and I was like, that's great actually. Let me talk about that. Corrective emotional experiences are like when you go into a good situation, and because you're witnessing the good situation, you realize that like an experience that you had in the past was not a vibe. Yeah, there's something like healing about seeing a good situation in front of you because of the contrast that you have from the past. And this is like in trauma survivors, they're always so grateful for the things that they get because they're so not accustomed to getting those things. And I've noticed like I'm drawn to trauma survivors in friends because they have like that same, like, you can just see it, it's adorable in their face. They love to be loved because they were so love starved. It's like so rewarding to me, is like looking at someone who has been in a bad situation be in a good situation, and they don't even have to say anything. It's just like this silent understanding that like it's good, what they're experiencing is good, and you can give that to them. So he was talking about how PTSD havers who were veterans in a war, they felt like in their group therapy that they were not able to really let go of what happened in the war, and that they had to live life as a monument to the people who they lost. And this made me think about how sometimes art is a way to set ourselves free from having to be the monument of who was lost. And if you have survivor's guilt, it's like you carry it around, and you almost are reluctant to get better because you feel like if you get better, then everyone's just gonna forget that that happened. It's almost like your subconscious doesn't want people to forget, so you walk around sick and unable to engage in life because it feels like almost selfish that people are enjoying life when you lost people in the war. Something I've like implemented in my life is like art as the physical monument of an experience that I've gone through, that I don't have to walk around feeling like I have to display my lack of well-being for people to know what I've gone through. A lot of the times, if you're willing to share what you've gone through, then it becomes like in a public way, then it becomes a lot less of a burden on you that you have to display illness so that people know that something was wrong. It's like if you are publicly telling your story about what went wrong, that is separate from you, and you can walk away from it, and you can say like, this is the evidence of the fact that that happened, and I don't need to be the sick one. Like, the story is sick, what happened is sick, and this is like a testament to that. So you don't have to like carry it around in your body. So I found art to be really helpful to my healing process, because I do have CPTSD in a number of ways, and I've talked to a professional about that, and she was like, yeah, you're severely traumatized by your childhood. And I was like, okay, I think I knew that, but it's good to hear you say that. Something I thought was interesting was that there are 10 kids in this country at the time of this book being published who have CPTSD and grew up in emotionally neglectful and traumatizing houses, and like abusive houses. There's 10 of them for every one war veteran. And that's kind of what this whole book is about, is like bringing awareness to the fact that there's trauma embedded in our society, and like basically kids are incredibly vulnerable to becoming traumatized because they're so fragile early on. And PTSD isn't just something that happens to adults who go to war. It is also something that happens to children and then stays in those adult children, and those adults feel like there's something wrong with them. But there's not. There's something wrong with the people who did what they did to them. You know? He says this about his patients, that you should never believe what you read in a textbook over what you're seeing in real life. And the example that he gives is that it used to be said that like there were a handful of cases of incest in the US, and he was like, I don't believe that because that's in a textbook, and what I keep seeing in real life is like incest survivor after incest survivor, and I still think the numbers are going up to this day. Like, there's no way that the numbers of incest reported are accurate. I myself have met like 5 people who have dealt with incest in their immediate family. Like, that is just me walking around, like meeting people. You guys, this stuff is common, and like, it's bad, and it's traumatizing. And yeah, he basically just said like, don't believe what you read in a textbook over what you're seeing in real life. At the end of the day, like, what you see in real life is real life, and what you're reading in a textbook, it's a book. It's something on a piece of paper. Like, you gotta believe what you're seeing, and you have to assume that what you're seeing is a pretty accurate representation of reality, because it literally is reality. He told the story about how he was at a mental hospital one time to treat people and to do therapy and group therapy, and this one person was not responding to being told what to do and was like frozen, and they ended up like tackling her and forcing her to do something. And then later on in group therapy, she told a story about being so she tells the story about being, and he like thinks back to the time when they were tackling her and how much it must have felt similar to that, and feels really guilty. And then he says, if you're doing something to a patient that you wouldn't do to a friend, consider that you might be recreating their trauma. Which is like really good. It's like, if you wouldn't treat a friend like that, you need to think long and hard about what you're doing, because it's your job to look after their well-being, and people usually have reasons for being the way that they are. There was this patient that he had, and she came in and they were doing art therapy, and he said, like, draw a picture of your family, and she draws like a really disturbing sexual graphic of her as like a small child, and like the father figure basically her. And then she goes on to talk with him like everything was fine, and what he was witnessing was a split. It was a divide in the conscious mind that speaks and the subconscious mind that talks. She showed no signs of being able to actually speak about it, but she could draw about it. And someone asked me one time, like, do you believe in left and right brain? And I was like, I don't really know, but I do believe in verbal and nonverbal brains. And I know for a fact that there are things that my nonverbal brain knows and tries to tell me that I can't talk about. And there are things that don't translate into words that the nonverbal brain has seen and has recognized as patterns and is trying to inform me of. In people who have CPTSD, there's a split between the conscious and the subconscious, and the subconscious knows more than the conscious because it was made so that they couldn't speak about something, that it was really dangerous to speak about something, and so they like forgot about it. And this is also why I dream journal. When I dream, there's like so much symbolism. There are things that get brought up that I don't even know that I feel that way. Like recently I dreamed that I was in a church and the church was falling apart, and it was like I was at the very top of the church and like the floorboards were crumbling. And I realized like that's my feeling of not knowing if my spirituality is stable or not. That's my feeling of like a lack of faith, and then also like doubting my own beliefs because of my distrust of religion. Yeah, that was something I realized when I was dream journaling, because like my brain is saying the top of a church is not a safe place to be. Like, do not go to the top of a church and try to land, because the floorboards will crumble out from under you. This is an unstable place, basically. So something that he talked about was mirror neurons, and how from the day that you're born, you learn how to be a human from the people who are around you. There's like parts of your brain that are wired and predisposed to and evolved to collect information about the world around you by matching the world around you. And that's why babies are always responding to the way that their mother is acting. And you can see this in this one video that I watched, and literally in any baby ever that's hanging out with their mom, they're so attuned to their mother's mood. And when the mother's like in their face being like, oh my god, happy baby time, oh my god, things are great. If like a father comes up and is yelling at the mother and the mother is crying, and the baby's crying as well. We learn very early on to attune to our environment. And something that I was thinking about this is like when people are like, oh, psychicness isn't real, I'm like, no, psychicness is evolved into our very being. Psychicness is mirror neurons. Psychicness is I know what you're feeling because my brain is recreating the experience of being you inside of me as we're speaking. Maybe my mirror neurons are overactive or more sensitive or something. I think that's called hypervigilance, and that is a symptom of having PTSD. But that's like how I would explain psychicness. Him talking about mirror neurons reminded me of that. Something else that I was thinking is like, when I was in an abusive relationship, this person was so manipulative, and not only were they manipulative in how they were like planning the world around me, but they were also manipulative in that they had no control over their emotions, and because I was mirroring them, because that's what you do in a relationship with someone, especially one that you're trying to monitor them for threats, when I was mirroring them, I would feel it's dying. I would feel their anger, I would feel their shift in mood because I was mirroring them. As I was feeling their emotions, I began to be like, oh my god, I need to save them. And so they would basically they had no skills to regulate their emotions, and I would come to the rescue. And I would, oh. The fuck? Anyway, we're gonna have to continue this later because that light just went out. I'm gonna charge that, I'll be back. Okay, well, my apologies for the change in lighting. Apparently that light died, but I'm just gonna keep going. And hopefully you don't mind that there's not an orange backlight anymore. That's disappointing, but okay, I guess. Where was I? Oh yeah, so I would mirror them, and then to monitor their mood to make sure I was good. And then when they were not feeling good, I would pick up on that, and like that in and of itself was a way that I manipulated myself to take care of them before they even asked for it, before they even needed it. Back then I had no idea what was going on, and I had no idea that I was actually in danger emotionally and physically. Like, it just didn't register that this was an abusive relationship, even though like I was in the midst of one. Something that I've learned since then is how to completely shut down my mirroring. Like, when I'm around someone and they begin to show like extremely dysregulated emotions, I have learned how to fully disconnect from them and no longer meet them where they are, because I've learned that that doesn't help. I used to think that that was the only way to do relationships, and that's why I was in so much danger, was I didn't know how to take a step back and be like, this person's dealing with something actually rather scary and it's making them frightening to me, and to stay regulated I need to disconnect. That's like how you can protect your psyche from danger. Sometimes you just need to know that there is a third place in a relationship. It's not them, it's not you, it's an emotionally stable point that you use to like go back to when they're acting spooky. And believe it or not, I actually learned this from them, because they would never feel empathy for me. I would just see it in their face that they were not with me in my pain when I was hurting, or when they had just hurt me. It was just like they were dead. They weren't matching me at all. And so I actually learned it from them, how to disconnect from the person in front of me. Thanks, bud. You taught me that trick at least. Something I saw on Reddit one time was that narcissism is CPTSD. And I was like, okay, maybe not. I really don't know. Because I know for a fact I have CPTSD. I don't think I'm narcissistic. I think that narcissism is something different than CPTSD. Sometimes like we can show similar traits if we're at like the peak of trauma and the peak of being triggered, but it's like the difference between someone who's narcissistic and someone who has CPTSD is that narcissistic people don't change when they're regulated. Like, they still don't care even when they're regulated. The story about a girl who's on a first date, and in the middle of the night she started to attack the guy she was on a first date with, and apparently she had just totally forgotten where she was and was all of a sudden being by her father. She attacked him and was really afraid, and it's like, the thing that I thought about the story was, from the guy's perspective, it's not his responsibility to ever see her again. Like, she literally attacked him when he was most vulnerable. But from her perspective, it's like she's on a healing journey. Like, that's not who she is, that's who she is when she's in a flashback. And so, like, he could say, oh, she's narcissistic, but it's like, to know if someone is or isn't narcissistic, you kind of have to watch them over time. Because she got treatment and she felt a lot of guilt and remorse about that, and a narcissist would not have. A narcissist would have deflected and probably blamed the guy. So traumatic reenactment is, it can be many things, but I'll talk about this one way that I think about it. Traumatic reenactment is like when the subconscious knows something that your conscious is unwilling to admit, and your subconscious drives you repeating the behavior. So this will show up like you keep getting into bad relationships with because you were as a child. Basically, like, you may not remember what happened when you were a kid, but the pattern is showing you that something happened and you're drawn to that circumstance because your subconscious is familiar with that circumstance and is attempting to tell you that there was something there that you aren't remembering. Traumatic reenactment can be a lot of things, though. It can also be like the exact situation that you found yourself in with your mom and dad. You might find yourself in with like a boy and a girl later on when you're grown up. Literally, the way that you think about the world becomes patterned if you don't recognize where the pattern comes from, and your subconscious does everything it can to get you to recognize this is something you've seen before and this is where it came from, and if you don't want to repeat it, then you're going to have to start thinking about the world differently, and you're going to have to start interacting with the world differently too, from a state of consciousness, preferably. There was a brain scan that was done of depersonalization, and it just shows like in the prefrontal cortex there's like a deadness, which, side note, that's what psychopaths experience as well. This is like rational decision making, and like basically your humanity is here, and there's like increased deadness when someone's dissociated or depersonalized. There's just like a blank space here, and it's called like blanking out. And it's interesting because I know that exact feeling. I know the feeling of just completely detaching from reality. And I know this because when I was a kid, I would be berated. Before I even really understood what words meant, I was being insulted, like, in a crazy way, you guys. Like, yelled at horribly, like verbally abused. And then I would like go to my room and I would think, like, with my rational brain, with my true self, I'm never ever gonna speak to these people or respect these people ever again. But I had to come out of my room eventually. And so what I did was I would just like deaden myself. I would completely disconnect from reality, and I would put on a face like, oh, everything's better now, like, I'm so sorry, I'm the brat, I'm the worst, I suck, I am a little bitch, I suck, I'm so sorry, and everything you said was right, and I'm ready to be good now. And it would just be like I was completely detached, and I could just tell because like that's what he describes. The way that he described the brain looking is like the way that I felt. Like, I know that's what was happening. I was depersonalizing, I was disassociating. And yeah, it would be so that I could like reconnect with my parents because I was a kid and I needed them. But that's exactly what I'm describing. Like when I say like I also know how to stop mirroring people, it's like I know how to stop responding to reality and respond from like something very fake and shallow instead if I need to. And I'm pretty sure that that turned into masking as I got older. I'm very good at masking and acting, and I've been practicing my whole life. And it started when I wasn't accepted for who I am and what I felt. Something that I've noticed is that like the split between the fake and the real personality, there were times in my life when I started to believe that the fake was real, but journaling always has helped me find what's real again. And I think that journaling is really important for trauma survivors because it helps you remember what's true, because you can see it in front of you. When nobody's watching, when you know that nobody's going to be seeing anything that you're saying, when you know that you're fully alone, when you know that you're not faking for anybody, and you just see these like patterns of feelings over and over again, you're like, oh, well, nobody's here, and I'm still saying that, so that must be what's real. That must be what's true for me, versus this other thing that I created. The times when I felt like least connected to my reality were the times when I stopped journaling. It's really important to journal if you're someone who like has lost yourself in the past. I was talking about how like ADD versus ADHD is a thing, and like if somebody is just totally blanked out, then they don't get treatment and attention. And so like a lot of times people who disassociate, they go under recognized as like experiencing severe trauma or experiencing like neurodiversity as well. If you're just blanked out, then nobody notices you. I thought that was interesting. I also like know that I'm autistic, and I also know that I have CPTSD, and sometimes I wonder if like my brain developed this way because of the trauma that I was undergoing during like my developmental years. Like if you hit someone, it could leave a scar for forever, and I'm pretty sure if you verbally abuse someone like 3-4 times a week pretty badly in their growing up, then like you can change the structure of their brain as well. And yeah, I feel like maybe that happened, and maybe there's more overlap between like autism and being a trauma survivor than people think, because a lot of the things that we talk about when we're talking about autism, they overlap pretty well with what we talk about when we're talking about CPTSD as well. And one thing that he talks about is how like there's different parts of your brain, and there's like the one that senses, and then there's the one that like basically takes everything that you're sensing and like makes it into a cohesive symbol for you to digest. And he talks about how when you're really scared, the part that makes a cohesive symbol goes offline. And so you start to experience the world more in like sensory input, and it just starts to feel like too much, and you get overwhelmed because it's just so much input and you don't really know how to make sense of it. That's a similarity between autism and CPTSD as well that I was thinking about. I had a friend who was like, she was just like, I'm so confused all the time. Like, I'm just so confused. And I just feel like that she's very, like, she's traumatized. She's gone through a lot in her life. But then she also is, like, looking into being diagnosed as autistic as well. And she believes she's autistic. I'm like... Something he was talking about is how in these like group therapies, sometimes there will be like shared understanding, but also that when you're only connecting with people who have been through similar experiences to you, that shared understanding can become like a tribe mentality, and it can isolate you from other people who experience other things. And this kind of reminds me of like how if I spend too much time with like only Democrats or only Republicans or only straight people or only gay people or only white people, I don't think there's ever been a time when I've hung out with only any other race, which is interesting. But if I hang out with like a homogenous group for too long, then I start to feel uncomfortable. It like does make me a more rigid person who's incapable of like accepting and working with other perspectives. It's important not to get like us versus them in anything, in any arena of life, I think. Especially when you're trying to heal from something. Like if you're like, oh, only these people understand me, I'll never be able to be around these other people, it can be dangerous because it's like, well, then you've made your whole entire life about being a survivor of what you went through. That's very isolating. That has the potential to just dig you into an even deeper hole, I think. You know how I was talking about the nonverbal and the verbal? Alexithymia is the inability to feel your feelings, and I'm thinking like the nonverbal and verbal being disconnected, being split, like the conscious and the subconscious mind being split, could easily lead to you not being able to sense your feelings, because the nonverbal part of your mind is the one that can literally feel your feelings, and then the verbal part of your mind is conscious. And like if you have a hard time becoming conscious of your subconscious, if there's like a lack of connection between those two, then of course you're not going to be able to feel your feelings or experience what your feelings are trying to tell you. You're disconnected from them. You're disconnected. Have you talked about the idea of like inhaling and exhaling being like, one of them slows your heart down, one of them speeds it up? And then he was talking about the parasympathetic and the sympathetic, and one of them is meant to like kick the adrenaline in and one of them is meant to slow it down. And then he also talked about the mother and the father and how like evolutionarily, and this isn't always this way, but the mother is meant to like soothe and the father is meant to like play with the child, which I kind of think is fucked up. Like even saying it makes me feel weird, because that's like, I'm not gonna be that type of mother. I'm not only gonna soothe my child, like I'm gonna be both. I'm gonna be both, thanks. A disorganized attachment is fear with no resolve, a feeling of like not having anywhere to attach to. And he talked about this and I was like, that's interesting. You seek closeness outside of your family instead of inside of it. And that's because you can't rely on your family to provide closeness to you. Something I remember is like, you know how I talked about the split between like fake Lydia and real Lydia? Like fake Lydia was like, well, she was constructed to be very agreeable to my parents so that I could continue to connect with them. So it's, in a weird way, she is real because she really did want to reconnect with her parents. I remember like part of going out into the world after that was out of spite, wanting to connect with other people and being really friendly to other people, out of spite to my parents, to prove that other people would love me. Even if they couldn't love me for me, other people would. So it was almost like a fight response. Like I would go out into the world and be like, I'm gonna make people love me so that my parents see that I am actually lovable and that they were wrong. It's just really sad to think about. And this reminded me of like how in infancy you're really developmentally fragile. And I was watching the Kardashians one day and Scott is like a big fat crybaby, and Scott is like trying to get Kourtney's attention, and Kourtney's like literally like breastfeeding a baby, like her child that she had with Scott, and Scott's like, oh, you care more about the kid than me. And she's like so attuned to this baby, and I think instinctually she knows that the most important thing for this baby is that I'm there for this baby. And so she like literally walks away from Scott, and Scott, I think he's a narcissist, and he's just like, oh my god, you never care about me, you never think about me. But it's like, she's literally trying to raise your child. Like, you're so selfish. She's literally breastfeeding the baby that y'all had together. She's literally trying to keep him calm. She's walking away from you because you're screaming and it's upsetting the child. And I always think about that. Like, I just always think about that, because I really liked watching that scene because it made me feel like she's a good mom, and I'm proud of her for like putting a child above the man baby who's trying to take her attention from the child. That's what I wish my mom had done. He talks about how the first few hours are so important and determine so much in primates' brains about the rest of their life and their development. Like, if you leave a baby primate alone in their first few hours, they become ill and they can't recover from it. And that made me wonder, like, what is it doing to us as a species that we're born into hospitals, which are like scary places. They're spooky places. It's good that we have like medical care, but like we are all coming into the world under hospital lights. What type of tone is that setting for the rest of our lives? If it matters so much to our brain development, then like we should probably focus a bit more on making them pleasant, calm environments. Maybe there should be separate hospitals for childbirthing. He was talking about how if you're not real to your mom, then you're not real to you. And like you really need your mom as a child to like show you who you are, and that what they agree that you can be, you lean into. And I was thinking about like how as an adult I've been trying to like suss out what I would have been had I been supported in like better areas of my life and not like super shallow areas of my life. But it's so interesting because it's basically been baked into me at this point to have preferences for certain activities, just because like I became that way because I was getting rewarded for it. I was getting seen because of it. Who knows what I would have been, who I would have been if I'd been appreciated for who I am and not who she wanted me to be. We will never know because it's basically baked into me now. Like, I've developed the way that I've developed, and like I really can't change that. And some of the preferences I have for the rest of my life are gonna be directly because of the way that I was raised, and that's okay. And I'm learning to accept that I am who I am because they were how they were, and I just have to work with that, and that's just a fact. Some of the preferences I have now, some of the proclivities I have now, they were baked into me when I was 7 years old, and I can't change that. And that's just the way it's gonna be, but I will always wonder who I would have been had I been supported differently. Had I been supported in a more well-rounded way, in a more respectful to my genuine nature sort of way. We will never know, and that's okay. Oh, but this reminded me of something that I do. Like, I will host conversations between me and people, and I started doing this probably around 2020. I will like have conversations between me and people that make me feel validated in ways that they've never made me feel validated. And the way that I think about it is like, this is if they were a good person, the way that they would treat me, and therefore like it's almost like their higher self, like I'm talking to their higher self. And it really is helpful because your brain doesn't know the difference between an imagined scenario and a real scenario, and it makes changes to your psychology that you couldn't make if you weren't imagining having that conversation. Like, you can talk about it with yourself all you want, but at the end of the day, sometimes you have to host a conversation between you and someone for it to feel like you had a conversation with that person. And sometimes it has to feel like you had a conversation with that person where they were validating you for you to accept yourself for who you are. Even though it's you literally projecting yourself into the chair in their skin and being kind to you from their perspective, even though that's what it really is, it's like, it is so helpful to hear them say things that you need to hear them say. The fact that he mentioned that is pretty validating to me, because it's like I feel like I've almost been like imaginarily raising and like tweaking my own psyche. And in 2020, I think I had an awareness that like, I think I heard somewhere that your brain finishes developing like mid to late 20s. And I started to realize like, oh, I think I'm gonna try to make as many changes to my personality as I can in a positive way, in a conscious way, before I finish developing as possible. I'm gonna make as many little personalizations to my personality as I can before it's like fully baked, you know? And this reminds me, like, when I was in the throes of my abusive relationship, which ended in 2020-ish, I was just so used to using them as my like receptor, as my mirror, that my brain had like arranged itself to receive only what they would say. But I feel like when I started to host conversations between myself, like I was literally changing the way that I could receive and feel feelings. It's like I had all these emotions available to me in my spirit, but I wasn't receptive to them because I wasn't practicing being receptive to them. And now I'll like, the main person I talk to is me. Like there are positive emotions that I can feel now because I'm like literally creating the capacity to feel positive emotions by speaking with myself in a kind way so frequently. And this can change day to day as well. Like the way that you talk to yourself in one day will change your brain literally as you sleep. And the next day you'll be more receptive to feeling like positive emotions if you spoke to yourself kindly the day before. And I know that that's a fact because I've felt it myself. And I also read this book called The Brain That Changes Itself, and they talk about that. How every single day you're rewiring your brain. That means the way that you behave and the words that you hear today impact the way that you can receive words tomorrow. Ain't that cool? Something I was thinking about is if you can heal narcissism by treating trauma, then I see no reason why the versions of people that I create in my head couldn't be real if they treated their trauma. You know what I'm saying? They did this experiment in this book on kids who had CPTSD and then kids who didn't, and they were like, make up a story where blank 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 happens and then blank. And so they would give like, oh, Sally goes to the grocery store and the traumatized kids would be like, and then she gets stabbed. And the non-traumatized kids would be like, and then she gets carrots. And to me, I'm laughing because like when people grow up and they have this like chaotic sense of reality, it can turn into like a sense of humor. Like they can have like a really chaotic way of perceiving the world where like anything could happen at any time and it makes them funny. It can make them scary too, but it can also make them funny. Sometimes I can find like people who weren't traumatized to be a little bit bland, and it's just because they don't see that things like reality could literally get ripped out from under us at any time. It's not in their being to think like that, and so I can find them like a little NPC like, and I'm happy for them, but I'm also like, you're less funny to me because I feel like you see things so much simpler and it's like harder to relate to them as well. Diagnostics are like descriptions and real people are like handmade furniture from Craigslist. They're colorful and real. And he did not say this, but I did. What he says is that like, what he says is that he asked someone what he should call this patient, like, are they narcissistic, do they have CPTSD, are they autistic, are they schizophrenic, what did you call them? And then the person who was working with that patient was like, oh well, I just called them Joe because that's their name. And then he goes on to say like, well actually it's really important that you don't just see them as their diagnostics because there's so much to a person that makes them the way that they are. They're a whole ecosystem. They're a whole system. And sometimes what's on the paper and what's in real life can never add up. The way that what's verbal and what's nonverbal can never fully be the same. Words are a way that we describe what is, and we try our best, but sometimes there are things that just don't translate into words. There are things that you can feel and you can know that you could never get someone else to feel and know with words. So yeah, what I said was diagnostics are like descriptions and real people are handmade furniture from Craigslist, colorful and real. And it's like, when you're scrolling on Craigslist, you see like the line descriptor, but like when you get the piece of furniture in real life, it's just like, oh, like they're just such different experiences. Sometimes it's better to like know that when you're reading someone's diagnosis, that there's a real person behind it, and that it's more important that you get to know the real person. Oh, so something he was talking about was when there's a split in someone's personality and they're writing from one perspective versus another, they'll have different handwriting. And I think that's really interesting because I myself have incredibly different handwriting, and there were times in my life when I had like a big psychological trauma and then I developed a certain sort of handwriting around that time. It's so weird. It's freaking weird. Like, there are changes in my psyche that happened and it showed up in the way that I write on paper. Like, some people, they learn how to write and then their handwriting stays the same for the rest of their life. For me, going in and out of developmental phases and like areas of my psyche that developed during different developmental phases, my writing will change. I'll be in this part of my psyche on this page of my journal, and then in this part of my psyche on this page of my journal, and I'll notice, oh, there's a shift. There's a shift in the way that I'm feeling in my body. There's a shift in the way that I'm thinking. There's a shift in the way that I'm writing. And it's just crazy because like I'm like 5 or 6 people within one person. It's not like that for everybody, but I have a whole bunch of different perspectives on life, and it's hard for me to actually come to like one solid decision about anything. And that's just part of being me, I guess. But he mentioned that and I was like, oh shit, like that's me. So he was talking about how in education we're oftentimes like, oh, this is better and this is worse, and this is winning and this is losing. And he was talking about how that in and of itself is like a really degrading way of thinking about things. And I've always thought that. I've always felt so weird that there's like an A to F scale in classes. Like, you're really gonna try to put best to worst as your way of reacting to a student's life force? That's weird. I've also always thought that like having like a standard curriculum for every child in the country is freaking weird. It's freaking depersonalized as fuck. And like for kids who are already struggling at home, like you don't need to put them on a win or lose system. Like that's not what they need. I think we all know that, and if we don't, then I mean, some people I don't think do know it. Some people would make excuses for that system, and I would say that they're wrong. Straight up. In this society, there's an attack on repressed memories where people are like, oh, that didn't happen, these don't exist, blah blah, blah 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 blah. And I think it's so disrespectful. It's just so disrespectful because so many people say that it does exist. It's just really disrespectful to like take people's experiences that they've had and be like, there's no psychological phenomenon where you forget. Like, what are you talking about? It's medical gaslighting, honestly. A lot of times you can actually see the impact of events in people's life timelines. Who they are as a person fundamentally changes after these events, and it doesn't even matter if you can remember the memory. You just know that like someone doesn't change like that unless something happened. You don't even have to know that like whatever it was happened. All you have to do is look at how someone was before and how someone was after to know that there was an event. Something that he said was that dissociative amnesia is linked to traumatic reenactment. As in, if you do have like an experience where you have like dissociative amnesia, which is when you forget something that happened to you that was traumatic, then you're more likely to recreate that again and again. So you won't have a conscious awareness that something happened, but your subconscious will make that happen over and over again. And when you do finally remember, you have it stop. And for me, this showed up in my dad was abusive, and I forgot a lot of the abuse that took place. And when I was finally in over my head in a very similarly abusive relationship, suddenly I remembered. And as soon as I remembered, Like, just so many memories came flooding back to me. And like, I was reunited with my conscious awareness that my dad was abusive. When that happened, I stopped recreating the trauma in my serious relationships. That isn't to say I don't have flare-ups. I do have flare-ups. I have bad flare-ups. It's a trauma bond, and like, I'm susceptible to trauma bonds because I was abused as a child, and that's just by a narcissist, and that's always going to be like that. However, I was in like monogamous, serious, long-term abusive relationships before, and I have not been since I remembered. And that is a testament to what he said, which is that people who experience dissociative amnesia, they're more likely to recreate their trauma. I just know it's true because I know that like after I remembered, I stopped recreating my trauma. My subconscious was relieved. It alleviated the pressure to recreate this pattern to communicate to me that something was there, because I knew something was there and I was able to speak on it finally. So introception is the feeling of having an inside that is separate from the outside, like a stable place to go that and developing a relationship with myself. Yeah. Introception for me is something that I can only form it when I'm spending a lot of time alone. I'm still like a very delicate ecosystem inside of me because of the damage that has been done by being abused as a child and in my young adulthood as well. So I'm still a fragile system, but I know that there's space inside of me that I can go to be with myself and to become more like engaged in reality in a regulated way. I know that that's there. The way that I developed it is by just like talking to myself regularly. And not just talking with myself, it's like communicating with myself. Because it's not just like words, it's also like you have to put the non-verbals with the verbals. You have to mix them, you have to learn how to get them communicating. You have to dream interpret, you have to draw, you have to see beautiful things, you have to go on walks. They like mixing. And one thing that he said was that there's no progress that you can make on any problem until you trust yourself and others and reality. And I thought that was interesting. And then finally, he ends the book with trauma is the public health crisis of now. And school is where we have the capacity to intervene in people's lives and to treat it, and we need to make it more of a priority in children's lives to intervene in situations where they're being neglected and abused. Like, that's where we can catch it early. Let me just say, like, if there was less of a focus of being good and performing well and doing for adults, if there was less of a focus on that in my schooling, then someone might have taken a second and noticed that there was something going on in my life that was not okay. I do believe that had school prioritized the well-being of the children more, then there could definitely have been more being done for myself and for others. I think that it's incredibly important that kids who are going through awful circumstances are intervened upon. I wish that there was a better system for protecting kids set in place. I wish there was more of a priority on detecting potentially abusive circumstances. That's like one of the things I'm most passionate about in this whole entire life, actually. Those are my reflections on The Body Keeps the Score, and I do hope that you enjoyed this reflection. have a beautiful day. Thanks for watching Literature with Lydia, and I'll see you in the next one.